Hello again, and welcome to NCCP Anywhere for the weekend of March the 27th. I'm visiting homilist Dave Stawick, and I send you greetings from Washington, D.C., where, once again, the cherry blossoms are blooming. And we have a couple of views here from my wife, Susan, that she got in this past few days. We had peak blossoms at the cherry trees near the tidal basin about midweek. So here are some views from your nation's capital, and we hope to get you into the spring spirit. We continue our Lenten series of sermons today with a familiar excerpt from the Gospel of Luke in the 15th chapter. All the tax collectors and sinners were gathering around Jesus to listen to him. The Pharisees and legal experts were grumbling, saying, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Jesus told them this parable. A certain man had two sons. The younger son said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the inheritance." Then the father divided the estate between them. Soon afterward, the younger son gathered everything together and took a trip to a land far away. There, he wasted his wealth through extravagant living. When he had used up his resources, a severe food shortage arose in the country, and he began to be in need. He hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. He longed to eat his fill from what the pigs ate, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have more than enough food, but I'm starving to death? I will get up and go to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Take me on as one of your hired hands.' So he got up and he went to his father. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was moved with compassion. His father ran to him, hugged him, and kissed him. Then his son said, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quickly, bring out the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Fetch the fatted calf and slaughter it. We must celebrate with feasting, because this son of mine was dead and has come back to life. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his older son was in the field. Coming in from the field, he approached the house and heard music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked what was going on. The servant replied, 'Your brother has arrived, and your father has slaughtered the fatted calf because he received his son back safe and sound.' Then the older son was furious and didn't want to enter in, but his father came out and begged him. He answered his father, 'Look, I have served you all these years, and I never disobeyed your instruction. Yet you've never given me as much as a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours returned, after gobbling up your estate on prostitutes, you slaughtered the fatted calf for him.' Then his father said, 'Son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found.'" The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. Well, welcome back for the second half, sports fans. Last week at Greenmount and Miller's churches, I was privileged to preach in person. It was great to see everybody again. And I likened last Sunday to halftime at a basketball game. After all, we were in the midst of the first weekend of the NCAA basketball tournaments, and also at about the midpoint of our season of Lent. It occurred to me that as we were midway through the 40-day cleanse, as we call our sermon series this Lent, we could use a little bit of a breather, just as the players need a break after 20 minutes of competition. I talked about what went on at halftime with the players toweling off and sitting down, getting a drink, and the coaches instructing, making adjustments, encouraging the players to keep up their efforts of doing their thing, making their cuts, rebounding, following up their shots, diving after loose balls, getting on the floor. And amid all of that basketball imagery, I admitted to the parishioners that they might think that their preacher had gone March mad. But it is that time of year, both in a basketball sense and in a Lenten sense. We're down to the Sweet 16, and our brackets have probably been dismantled by Gonzaga and Arizona falling on Thursday night. And we're down also to the second half of our Lenten journey. So refreshed and restored, let's get to the second half and have a spirited start to it, or as coaches might say, a strong first 5 minutes. Our series this year is about troublesome attitudes that we want to get rid of. Not just the ideas of sins like the 7 deadly sins, but troublesome attitudes and behaviors. Like spring cleaning, like removing obstacles in our lives that blunt us from being the resurrection people we're meant to be coming up on Holy Week and Easter. That's what we're facing up to here during Lent this year. Bad habits, bad attitudes, we want to put aside. We want to give them up for Lent. Things that separate us from God and from each other. We've considered mindsets, attitudes, expressions that are problematic. You know, in considering these examples, I thought back on the gospel story that I preached on 2 sermons ago, I think it was, back in January. It was about the wedding feast at Cana. Remember that? I did it from the kitchen. I had the wine bottle out and everything. And I was thinking that how most of the things that we are concentrating on here in Lent that are problematic attitudes were things that Jesus could have easily done when his mother told him the wine had run out at the party and implicitly directed him to do something about it, to rectify the situation. Oh, Mom, really? Just to review, the attitudes that we're looking to shake off this season so far are being shortcutters, being excuse makers, and last week, being shoulder slumpers. This week, as we begin the second half, we want to face up to one of the most common on the list for me, being an eye roller, rolling my eyes. I do it far more than I should. So I'm going to call myself out and let you in on one of the things that makes me an eye roller with great frequency. I roll my eyes all the time when I watch the news on TV, not just about the content, but about the way it's presented. Now, as some of you may know, my original full-time occupation was as a news reporter and anchor, first in radio back in Illinois, 3 different stations. Then I worked for an international wire service covering financial market news in Chicago, and then got transferred to Washington, D.C., and I was congressional correspondent. And after I got to D.C., I also got a job teaching a broadcast journalism class at American University for 2 years. So news reporting runs very deep in my being. I took it seriously when I was a practitioner and a teacher, and I take it seriously now and I will never give that up. To try to be a responsible news consumer, I try to watch daily, at least during the week, an hour or so of CNN, at least the top of the hour, the beginning of an hour, and a similar hour or so of Fox News to see what their narratives of the day are. But I know that both are picking and telling stories in such a way as to tell their viewers what they want to hear. And I come away thinking, well, I know what the fringe views are, but the truth as to what is really the important story of the day is probably somewhere in between that partisan divide. And I roll my eyes and I look for an antidote. And that is in the traditional old network TV newscasts that I grew up on. So think of, if you're old enough, think of Walter Cronkite and Huntley Brinkley, Peter Jennings. They have taken on a new relevance after being at one time seen as on the way out, dinosaurs once there was CNN and C-SPAN. But really, they do have this new relevance today, limited to only a half an hour. They have to tell stories in a compressed format, thankfully free of the talking heads with agendas on cable. And the three networks play it pretty straight most of the time. Now, I usually watch ABC's World News Tonight because it's on here in DC at a convenient hour, but mostly because I check it out because it's the top rated of the three newscasts. Like back when I was a reporter, you might think that there was a slant, but you wanted to know, nevertheless, what was on the front page of the New York Times, or what was on the front page of the Washington Post, or maybe even the Baltimore Sun. So ABC is sort of this newscast of record, so I watch, but I roll my eyes. The anchor, if you're not unfamiliar, the anchor of the newscast is a guy named David Muir, who is terribly, terribly grave and melodramatic and shticky. And on the broadcast, they use the word tonight, over and over. And as a matter of fact, it's Muir's first word at the top. They shoot him right about like I am now on this Zoom call, and he has his hand. He's always making hand gestures, and he kind of cocks his head to one side. And he starts every newscast. Tonight, breaking news, things are popping, pop, 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 blah, 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 blah. Anyway, they usually also end World News Tonight with a piece that they build up as being terribly profound, but it usually falls flat. Anyway, I watch World News Tonight not only because it's number one, but because I know I'm going to be entertained by those things that annoy me about it that make me roll my eyes. And I know that's really stupid, but that's World News Tonight. By now, I think you get my point. I know all about eye rolling because I do a lot of it myself. In fact, Susan says I frequently roll my eyes at her offbeat humor, so much so that I get a pretty good look at my own brain. Now, if there is a story from the Bible that could logically be connected to eye rolling more than our gospel from Luke today, I would like to know what it is. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with the excerpt that I read, which we know colloquially as the parable of the prodigal son. If you look closely at the citation for our reading today, you will see that there is a chunk from Luke chapter 15 that is omitted in today's excerpt. This scene has Jesus sharing two other parables before the one on the prodigal son. One's about a sheep that got separated from the flock, and the shepherd goes and finds the sheep. The other is about a woman who had 10 silver coins and lost one in her house, then found it and shared her good news with her neighbors. In each instance, and this is why I mentioned the ones that are left out, In each instance, including the third one, Jesus told his audience that in the same way as things happened in the parables that he mentioned, there will be great joy in heaven over one sinner who changes his heart and life. Now, I mention this because this chapter section in the Common English Bible that we use here at the NCCP churches is entitled Occasions for Celebration. So Jesus' sermon was about more than just the prodigal son. Also, other instances of things or animals or people being lost and being found, and the joy that will ensue. But of course, the most famous part of the excerpt we read today. And as I say, you probably know the story. A wealthy farmer has two sons. One of them asks for and receives his share of the inheritance early and then squanders it on wine, women, and song. His older brother stays home and dutifully works for the father day in and day out. When the wayward son hits bottom, goes broke, he comes back home and receives a warm embrace from his father and a cold, cold shoulder from his embittered brother. Here is where the eye rolling comes in, or we can very vividly imagine that it's included in the behaviors that we're going to hone in on. And as we make those connections in our reading today, we can see why eye rolling can be problematic and why we're targeting it this Lent. First, notice at the outset that the legal experts and the Pharisees are listening to Jesus expound. Jesus had developed a reputation as a scholar of the Hebrew scriptures that was very advanced for someone of his age. He was a biblical hotshot, and the righteous, high and mighty Jewish figures were looking down their noses at Jesus. Look at him. How righteous can he really be? Some hotshot. His stories are nice, but look at his behavior. Look who he hangs out with. And at that point, cue the rolling of the eyes. The lawyers and the Pharisees were more interested in legalisms than the grace and the mercy of the heart that Jesus wanted to share. So we can imagine that they roll their eyes at Jesus. Then in the parable, after the squandering son comes home, dragging his tail, his father hugs him, kisses him, has the servants put a fine robe on his back and a ring on his finger. I hope he got a bath in there someplace because he probably needed it. And the obedient son, the one who stayed home and busted his hump on the farm all those years during which his father didn't let him throw a party for his friends, the obedient son is livid. He is chapped. He is steamed. I mean, he has a meltdown that probably began and continued with him rolling his eyes. Can we honestly say we blame the second brother? Would we act any differently? I mean, this scene that he's seeing of the party is a travesty. The obedient son seethed. Look toward the end what he says and how he said it. The obedient son said, "When this son of yours returned," he couldn't even bring himself to call him my brother. Just this son of yours. When this son of yours returned after gobbling up the estate on prostitutes, you slaughtered the fatted calf for him. And this is rage, plain and simple, because the loyal son thought the situation was outrageous. He had to be rolling his eyes. But look at the next part of the text. The father obviously knew his obedient son was disappointed by the unfairness of the story. But just as the father had shown mercy to his wayward son who returned, the father in turn, in his wisdom, dispensed some grace to the disgusted son. As the scripture says, his father said, "Son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. Hopefully that lost and found broke through to the obedient son, but we don't really know. He may have just rolled his eyes and walked away. But if he did that, he would have missed the point that the Father would always be there for him too, with mercy and love. The message of the abundance of God's grace that is intended for us to appreciate here in our often unfair world now. God's grace prevails. Speaking of a focus on one's eyes, there's one other aspect of the story that is supremely important for Lent. The text says that when the prodigal son was still a long way off, his father saw him and was moved with compassion. His father ran for him, hugged him, and kissed him. Now take that in. Take that in. If the father saw that his son was a long way off, that was probably not a fluke. The father could have been busy day in, day out with other things, working on the farm, working with his other son who stayed. But he saw his son far off because he must have been scanning the horizon. He must have been looking for the figure of his wayward, disobedient, sinning son for many months or years, not rolling his eyes in disgust or disappointment, always looking for the errant son. And when the man saw the son, he ran to him. He met him where he was before the son could even get out. I'm sorry, forgive me. Jesus' parable captures so well the essence of our righteous relationship with God when we get it right, that St. Paul described in his letter to the Romans, chapter 5, when Paul wrote, God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. While we were still sinners. What wondrous love is this? Amazing grace. God is waiting and looking on the horizon for us constantly, inviting us to come closer, offering forgiveness and grace so abundant it almost makes you roll your eyes. But it's the real deal. Let us continue our Lenten disciplines to come closer to God this week, to give up our distance, to come home and to be welcomed by our Heavenly Father. Blessings to all of us on our journey this week. Amen.